Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into discussion of Gina Frangello's newest book, Blow Your House Down, a story of family, feminism, and treason, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after over 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Gina and Joanna, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so truly appreciative of it. And so, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Gina Frangelo for the launch of her new memoir, Blow Your House Down. Gina is the author of Every Kind of Wanting, A Life in Men, Slut Lullabies, and My Sister's Continent. Her short fiction, essays, book reviews, and journalism have been published in Ploughshares, the Boston Globe, Chicago Tribune, HuffPost, Fence, 5 Chapters, Prairie Schooner, Chicago Reader, and many other publications. She lives with her family in the Chicago area. Joining Gina in conversation is author Joanna Rakoff. Joanna is the best-selling author of the memoir My Salinger Year, which has been published around the world and adapted into a feature film starring Sigourney Weaver, and the novel A Fortunate Age, winner of the Elle Readers Prize and the Goldberg Prize for Fiction. She has written for Vogue, The New York Times, The Guardian, and many other publications. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Gina and Joanna to the stage.
Hi. Thank you for having us.
Hi, Sabir. Thank you so much. First, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be here. I was just telling Sabir, this is my first event with the Strand, and my first event with Gina, and I'll get to that in 1 second. But my family is from the Lower East Side, and my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my maternal grandfather, shopped at the Strand, from the time it opened, and my dad took me to the Strand as a child. I lived and worked near the Strand forever, and I live in Boston now. But anyway, this is very exciting for me to actually do an event with the Strand. And it's even more exciting for me to do an event with Gina, who I have been a fan of Gina's, for a very, very long time. We have a mutual friend who is a wonderful, wonderful novelist named Allison Amond. And I heard about Gina for years from her, an event, and she said, you have to read her books. I did. And I've just basically been a fan forever. I think when I was sent this galley, I read it, almost immediately, and wrote to Gina's publicist and said, I feel like she was born to write this book. And this is coming from someone who has loved her fiction, particularly A Life in Men. So I'm so excited to be here. I have a million questions for Gina, but I'm going to say 2 things to start. So the first is, there are a lot of people who are here tonight, which is so exciting. I'm so excited that I've been sort of keeping this book a secret in a way. I've been dying to talk about it with people. I have 2 close friends who read it and also loved it. I think they actually both blurbed it even. So I got to talk about it with them a little, but now the world can read it and I can talk about it with the world. I'm so happy there are 102 people here. This is amazing. I think that you probably all have questions for Gina. So my sort of ask for you guys is, as you have questions, please ask them in the ask a question area, and they'll kind of queue up, because it will be good for me to get a read on how many questions there are, because that will sort of give me a cue as to when I should stop asking the 4 million questions I have for Gina and get to your questions. So please, ask them as they arise. Don't wait until I say, and now it's question time. Just type them in and they'll just kind of accrue there. Okay, so now that that's done, Gina is going to read a bit of Blow Your House Down for us, and I'm so excited to hear her read it.
Thank you so much, Joanna. It's such a delight to see Joanna's face. We haven't actually seen each other in person in something like 12 years, but I adore her and her writing as much as she just expressed. So I'm giddy. And thank you to the Strand for having us. I'm just going to read very briefly from kind of like the middle of the book. One of the strains of the book is about caretaking my parents and my relationship with my parents, who lived downstairs from me for many, many years. And in this one, I'm talking to my dad, who has essentially been alone for the first time in 55 years, because my mother was in an assisted living facility after an accident. So I'll just read a bit from there. It has been a while since my father and I have engaged in what might be called a meaningful conversation. Generally, just as when I rang home during college and my father would pass the phone directly to my mother, actually, he rarely answered the phone at all. So when the kids and I come downstairs to visit and my mother is home, my father only even turns down the television if it's so loud that she complains she can't hear what we're saying over his racket. Generally, by which I mean I've forgotten how long this has been going on, but it may be as long as my parents have lived here in this house, my father and I rarely talk exclusively, using my mother or my children as a conduit. This was not always so. Because my father tended bar and kept unconventional hours in my youth, before he stopped working altogether, he was around the apartment much more than the typical father of his generation. And when he was home, he was always in the living room or the kitchen or on the front porch, accessible spaces where he made no particular effort at privacy. I could interrupt him anytime I wanted, ask him stories about the neighborhood when he was young, or beg him to read me the funny papers. I remember long afternoons on the couch by our front windows, looking through the shutter slats while my father, stacks of newspapers knee-high beside him, lamented how no one baked potatoes in their piles of burning leaves anymore, describing those long-gone charred skins and the soft white meat within with loving detail, or while he regaled me with a game my children still talk about, House on Fire, in which any new boy in the neighborhood could be lured into a game in which he was the, quote, house that was, quote, on fire, and before he knew it, all the other boys, the firefighters, had surrounded him in a circle and were peeing on him to put the fire out. Although my father referred to his time alone with me as babysitting, the truth is that we spent a fair amount of time alone, especially after my mother went back to work. While during my late teens and early 20s, my father and I tangled some about my mounting feminism. This consisted mostly of my getting in his face and not the other way around. We had never had any kind of falling out or clear delineation of when we stopped talking to each other in any substantive way, when my mother became his proxy for all things parental. It happened gradually, such that I did not even notice it really. Most of my friends didn't talk much to their fathers either. And it is only now that my mother has been in assisted living for so long that I realize my father and I have forgotten how to manage ourselves as a dyad, that the only way he seems to know how to interact with me is through statements of contention or need. A few times while my mother is gone, I go downstairs and sit next to my father, nestled in his heavily indented space on the couch, to watch television with him. Maybe I should claim that this happened more than a few times, given how long my mother was gone. But the reality is that although I cooked his meals and arranged his pills and cleaned his blood, although I marched the children through his apartment frequently so that he could demand hugs and kisses and coo over their beauty each time as though seeing them for the first time, I did very little to meet my father's needs for substantial social interaction while my mother was away. And so I am stunned one night when I am down there just days before my mother finally returns, and my father says, as though he has never uttered a less than lucid statement in his life, "Flower, you remember when I used to ride your ass all the time about how you should go hang out in the playground or buy Fioris with all the other kids and you wouldn't do it?" Do I remember this? Of course I remember. Before I made my father cry by moving out of state to go to college, I had already disappointed him through my refusals to make any even vague attempt at teenage cachet in his beloved neighborhood, by biding my time inside, scribbling and reading until I could fly away from him and everything his world represented. Sure, I tell him, you wanted me to be popular like Angie and those girls. It's understandable. But I was, and here a line comes to me unbidden from Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, just not that kind of animal. I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, my father almost shouts at me now. I look at him confused, even when we used to talk all the time, we didn't talk like this. I thought it would help you if you went out like the other girls, if you got a boyfriend. You seem lonely, but I was a chump. There was nothing for you there. I didn't know you were going to end up with a completely different kind of life, a kind of life I didn't know there was. In a movie about father-daughter relationships, this scene would take place a day before the father's death. This longed for so deeply, so wildly, that in fact I had not dared to long for it, never considered it imaginable. Vindication of my choices, my pursuits from my father would be the words to bring my entire life full circle and grant me some previously elusive peace. But in reality, my father is years from death still. Soon he won't be able to walk well enough to go to the toilet, much less bang on the wall with his cane to calm me down. Soon he won't be capable of this sort of sustained introspection, and his life will disappear into a crack in his mind from which he will no longer emerge. My father and I will have years ahead of often ridiculous, often difficult interactions as his caregiving needs increase alongside my inability to meet them. And even now, there's a part of me, that same part that would not accept a meal train, telling me that my father's beautiful epiphany is misguided, is undeserved because my life isn't what he thinks, because the different kind of life he didn't know existed doesn't exist in some sense, at least not anymore. But just for a moment before I leave us to our respective unravelings, I'm going to step 1 inch to the side for a different view. Just for a moment, I'm going to see myself through my father's eyes that night, his 45-year-old daughter, who looks nothing like the 45 of our old neighborhood, whose life has looked nothing like he could have predicted, recognized, or even dreamed. Just for 1 fucking second, I am going to bathe in the light of his recognition, his seeing not just the 2013 me with a half-hidden face, but the me I have been for 35 years, who clawed my way somewhere new, without a map, while he did his best out of love to hold onto my ankles and drag me back. Oh, come on, he used to snort when my mother suggested moving out of the neighborhood. Everywhere's the same. What are you kidding? You think there's somewhere different from here? We are, my father and I, each about to keep sliding down an arduous hill, no possible traction to climb back up, no way of stopping until we reach the bottom. But for tonight, this is one true thing. My father is proud of me, not because I married well, not because I gave him grandchildren, not for my master's degrees or my books he doesn't read anyway, not even for this house he lives in. He is proud of that young girl who resisted and refused his limited view of the world before any of those possibilities were even on the table. It is enough. It is what I will be given, and just for a moment, I hold it close for that girl I used to be, who deserved his respect no matter what I may have done since. She is in here somewhere still. She's in me. Maybe she is envisioning something now that I can't see yet.
Oh my God, Gina, thank you. I feel like that scene captures.
I should have known better. My parents.
I know.
My parents. So.
I kind of feel the same. Can we just sit here? We're not going to talk. That scene is such a perfect one to read, in that it so captures the way throughout the book. We're with you in all of these different moments in your life, and you keep probing deeper and deeper and deeper. Like, you don't just give us a scene, you sort of turn it on its ear. You say, let me sort of step to the side and look at this from a different way. And now let me look at it from a different way and a different way and a different way. And you keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into all these layers of kind of, class consciousness and gender consciousness in this very, very, very personal way. Like, you're simultaneously kind of telling us a story and slyly commenting on it in all these different levels and ways. And so anyway, okay. But for everyone out there, I just want to, I'm assuming some of you guys have read this book, but because it just came out yesterday, probably many of you haven't. So before we go any further, I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to ask Gina a big question that I hope she's going to answer at great length, which is, it's hard to pick a scene to read, I think, from Blow Your House Down in a way, because the book, and we're going to talk about this, is it's a big book. And so much of what I love about it is honestly that it's a huge, ambitious book that goes in all these different directions. And so so reading that scene a little bit makes you feel like this is a scene about Gina. This is a book about Gina and her parents, but it's actually not. I mean, it is, but it's not. So essentially, I mean, the kind of, I don't know, spine or through line of the book is that this is a memoir about a long, very passionate, but also at times very troubled and difficult extramarital affair you had. You know, sort of after, I might be getting these numbers wrong, after, you know, starting after approximately like 18, 20 years of marriage. And it's about the ways in which, this is like a really general overview, and then Gina's going to tell you more. It's about the ways in which this affair forced you to, in essence, reconsider who you were in relation to the roles that you had played for your whole life, you know, as daughter, wife, mother, you know, housekeeper, keeper of all things, like everything. But it's also about so much more. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of tell us about the book in your own words, like kind of give us, like, how do you, when people say, what's your new book about? You know, what do you say?
Well, so of course, obviously, and as a writer, you know, that is kind of like the hardest question on the planet, but
it's the most annoying question.
It's almost like easier in this book than it has been with my novels. Like, I remember when I was doing events for Life in Men, and I kept saying the phrase, it's about a woman who has cystic fibrosis, who's a traveler and is trying to live her life on a big canvas in the time she has left. And it was like, okay, I could say that sentence, and it was about more than that, but that sentence did kind of say it. And it's harder with this book because, I mean, there are sections of the book where I'm a kid, not many, but mostly it takes place over a nearly over a decade, from about 2011, when one of my closest friends on the planet, who I'd known since my teens, Kathy, died of ovarian cancer. And it happens during a time that my marriage had already been troubled for a while. And I, in sort of like my grief and the hole that my friend left in my life, I started having an affair with another extremely close friend, who's now my husband. And, you know, and lying about it for 3 years, and leading a double life, and kind of carrying around a bunch of toxic secrecy, and, you know, then finally confessing, and, you know, leaving my marriage. And at that point, in short succession, my father dies, and I'm diagnosed with breast cancer, and my divorce starts to go a little off the rails. And, you know, just life doesn't stop, you know, like it keeps hitting you full in the face. And so to me, it felt like there are not a lot of memoirs. I mean, there's so many great memoirs in the world, and I feel like it's evolved as an art form so much in the last just like 15 years or so, but there are not that many books, I feel, still about the collision of things in middle-aged women's lives, and particularly our lives when they're kind of going off the rails, and when they're kind of going off the rails from some things that we've chosen ourselves, you know, whether we've invited a certain amount of misfortune because of choices we've made, and then other things that kind of don't conveniently stop while we work out that misfortune we created, you know, like that just keep happening. And so that really, I mean, I don't have a tagline like with A Life in Men. It's about just how messy the life of kind of many middle-aged women are, and how little that's represented, like how we're all assumed to be sort of static once we've married and had children, which is in fact the end point of many, 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 many memoirs by women, is like, all this shit went down, then I got married and had children, you know, and all was well. And at one point I could have written one of those memoirs myself, had I had any desire to write a memoir. Like I was in a happy marriage for, you know, or partnership with my ex for about 18 years before things started to go wrong. And, you know, I was a blissful mother and, you know, had my parents living downstairs, and it was sort of like this shimmering moment of gold. But then life keeps changing. Things keep happening. And, you know, that moment that sort of seemed like a static, like the end, didn't turn out to be the end. And here I am with kind of like, you know, a different husband and different body parts and, you know, dead friends and dead parents. And it just kind of kept going, and it still keeps going. So they're really like, in novels, there's the end. And in memoir, there really isn't. There's the last page.
Right. You know, it's interesting. You sort of are characterizing this as a book about middle age. And I somehow, in all of my million questions for you, I hadn't quite thought about it that way. I had thought about some middle-age specific, I have a couple of middle-age specific questions, like basically, maybe I'll just ask you this now. One of the things that I think that could be perceived as kind of shocking, but felt to me sort of revolutionary is there are these two poles in the book, one having to do with, you know, women's sexuality, your sexuality, just sex in general, and the other one having to do with institutionalized misogyny in Western medicine, basically, or in American medicine. And there are these two kind of through lines through the book, and at times they dovetail. Like there's a moment where I believe an oncologist says, you know, essentially says to you, I'm not quoting the book, but says, you know, you're probably never gonna orgasm following chemo. Like only this small percentage of women actually regain the ability to orgasm after chemo. And you're like, and it just seems like totally insane to you. And obviously that's not what happens at all. And there, you know, and there's this feeling of like, wait, where do these statistics come from? And like, does this oncologist know anything about how women orgasm? And like, what? And yeah, so
I was just going to say, it's actually, oh, go ahead. It was even worse because it wasn't even one individual oncologist. It was literally in a reference book that they gave women with breast cancer that had these scary sexual statistics in it. So it wasn't like one rogue person who said this insensitive thing. It was like, there it was in writing. And I was like, I literally almost didn't pursue chemotherapy because of it. So, I mean, I don't want to derail your question. So keep going. But yeah, it was even crazier than that.
Well, that really sort of is, I mean, I guess I have so many questions, but one question was sort of like, did you, I mean, what is a little bit radical in this book is that you're, as you've just said, you know, you are kind of, the book starts with you in middle age kind of blowing your life up, basically. And I wonder, I mean, I'm trying to think which question to ask first. I guess I wondered, like, in your fiction, you've written a lot of characters who are sexually daring, sexually adventurous, like in a pretty extreme way. All like while you were, you know, sort of married with a family in this kind of ostensibly, you know, kind of perfect domestic situation. And now you have this memoir where you're recounting your own kind of sexual life and kind of almost like a sexual reawakening. And was that where the book started? Like, where did the book start? And was that part of your project to write about sexuality in midlife?
So, I mean, it's interesting. Like, so the book didn't start there. I had been writing essays about my parents for, you know, I mean, at this point for, you know, almost 20 years. I had written a lot of short form nonfiction. And I had always had sort of these vague ideas that I would do an essay collection about my parents. And so I started setting all the essays together because I'd published a lot of them in various different forums, like the Nervous Breakdown and Psychology Today and like different places. And of course, once I sat them all down together, I realized that, you know, when you write an individual essay, you have to explain the lay of the land to the reader all over again every time you write an individual essay, and it's going to be published on some site or in some magazine. And so when I started looking at them together, I realized that they were covering a lot of the same ground. They were, repeating a lot of the same information or telling stories that essentially, they were different stories in terms of what happened, but they were showing the same things, And so I ended up cutting most of them from what became this project because I felt like, I only wanted the ones in there that were moving in time and showing sort of the very long decline that both of my parents had, and what was going on in my life at the time. And one of the things I realized, I talked about this a little last night, so apologies to anyone who was in that audience, but I also realized that in those essays, I had almost been a non-character. I was just sort of this like narrator who was standing over here saying things about, my parents and their eccentricities, and they were really eccentric and really like amazing people. But because I had been living a double life, for some of the time I was publishing those essays. And even before I was leading that double life, I was in a sense trying to portray this image of, of something that I wasn't feeling anymore in terms of my role as, a wife in this lovely family with, 2, then 3 children. And, and I was restless and I was not ready to cop to it. And so I was erasing myself from the story. And so, in addition to realize I couldn't just cover the same terrain about my parents, I also realized like, no, I have to step forward and say what was actually going on with me during this period of time. And that's where the book started to kind of crack open to things like sexual reawakening and things like, interpersonal dynamics in my own life. I have always been, I guess there's, a sort of psychosexual writer. I've always been interested in that subject matter. And it, I think for a long time, I was covering things, I was covering ideas in my fiction that I was afraid to have as part of my own identity, which is certainly not, one of the things that I really try to stress is it's not like I was leading some, 1950s stifled, repressed June Cleaver kind of life. I was a person in the world. I was working, I was writing books, I had many friendships and so forth. But there was this idea, I think, that came with the drive to get out of my old neighborhood, that sort of once I had gotten out and once I had attained this sort of like, this marriage and these children and, editing and teaching at colleges and so forth, that it was like, this was my success story that my mother had always wanted for me. This was my success story that I had spent my whole childhood dreaming of and had thought was unimaginable. And so, I wasn't willing to look at the fact that I had put kind of a box around myself, and it was like, here I was on display. Here's my success story. The end, the end, the end. And it was like, the more I was moving away from who I had kind of been when I first made those choices. I got married when I was 25 for the first time, and I was changing and things were happening in my life. I mentioned my friend Kathy's death, but of course other things as well. I eventually, the person in the box was artifice. And so it took me some time before I started moving outside the box. And at first I did so in a pretty destructive way by just basically like pretending to still be in the box, but living this other life over here where I wasn't. And most of the book, there are episodes throughout my life in the book and throughout, my marriage and my friendships and so forth, and my identity as a mother that happened before I break out of that double life and admit the truth. But most of the book is about essentially the aftermath of admitting to not being who I was pretending so hard to be, that really for a lot of years I thought I was that person. And then the fallout, of some of my choices, and the fallout of the fact that life didn't stop for my choices. Like I said, that then, when you're in the middle of a personal crisis, then somebody dies, and then you get diagnosed with an illness, and then you've sort of had this sexual awakening, and suddenly now you are having a bilateral mastectomy and having chemotherapy, and but that doesn't make you not the same. I mean, you're not maybe the same person. You go through change constantly, which is one of the things in the book, but you're still a sexual person. You're still had that experience of falling wildly and passionately in love. And so then it moves kind of on from the aftermath of divorce to sort of like, how are middle-aged women's bodies coded, and particularly how are they coded once they've been sick, and sort of the erasure of sexuality from our lives, and the erasure of change from our lives that comes from, that comes from everywhere. Like, it's not just the medical industrial complex. Like, those women are not terribly visible in film. They're not terribly visible in books and so forth. And so feeling like I kind of had to chart a template for myself of like, well, what does it mean to be now, I'm 50 when the book ends. I'm 52 now, but like to be 50 and to have, a replaced hip and not my own original breasts, and to have been walking around bald, and all these things, but to also at the same time be like reinventing this new life for myself that I had just started. And yeah, I guess just the collision of all those things.
In some ways it almost feels mythological, in that your body was almost kind of being remade and reborn as you were remaking your life. So obviously this all really happened to you, but in the scope of the book, it almost has a sort of like larger than life mythological feel. Like I mean this in the best way possible, like that there's a way in which kind of like what happens to your body is almost a metonym for what is happening in the kind of social structure of your life, that you're sort of remaking it. It's like you're a little bit Phoenix like rising from the ash. But
I mean, I've really long been interested in all of that, like in sort of like the way culture defines the body, and how different bodies are processed. And so it did make sense in a way that with my new life, I would have this new body to navigate, so that I think there's truth to that. I mean, it's not a truth I would have chosen, but it's what happened.
Yeah, that's okay. I feel we already have a few questions, so I'm just trying to figure out what are the most important questions for me to ask you. I'm going to talk a little bit about something that you and I have discussed, which is likability in a narrative. And so, I mean, one of the things that I loved and responded to so much in this book is it's written in a style that has an incredible urgency to it. It almost feels like it was written in a fever dream, even though it's this big and complex and kind of like structurally magnificent book. The narrative tone has this kind of fever dream urgency to it. Like it's almost as if like you are gripping me by the arms and saying, I have to tell you all this now. It's like spending a week in a cabin with, being sort of told this whole story. The scenes kind of relate to each other in this almost an associative way. Okay. But my question, there is a question there, which is, you present yourself with a lot of transparency. A word that I read a few reviews, and a word that kept coming up was raw, which is a word as a person who writes a lot of criticism that I have a lot of trouble with, because it's like, what does that actually mean? I feel like it just means, it doesn't really mean anything. I feel like it's used like in memoirs written by women in which there's like sex or death, or in which like women, like memoirs by women that aren't Eat, Pray, Love, basically. Like so anyway, my real question is, how did you kind of think about this question of presenting yourself in the book, because you almost take pains to kind of make it clear that you made, mistakes, and that there are things that you portray things that you are clearly, filled with anguish about. How did you make that choice, and what was that like writing, in this kind of very, very deeply honest way?
So, I mean, I think that my background as a fiction writer brought me to the table of writing memoir with a lot of very strong core beliefs in how a character needs to be developed, right? And what level of depth to go into about the character. And so, once I kind of realized that the moment I was typing the word I on my screen, the moment I was, talking about my own life, I was now the character, right? And so I was constricted, of course, by obviously like real life events and plots. I can't just decide my mother didn't die. I can't just decide like, I never had an affair. That didn't happen. And like, I don't have breast cancer. It's 2010 again, I mean, so obviously there were plot things that were predetermined, but I did realize that like I could have sort of tried to take a stance of keeping kind of the more messed up things that I had done at a distance, at arm's length. And and I do want to be clear, because I think it's so important for people who write memoir to talk about this, that of course being raw, and admitting things is not the same as having no boundaries and having actually just said every single thing that ever came into your head or that you ever did. I mean, it is still, of course, a curated book, with things that are dipped into, and the metaphor I use a lot is just like the 20% of the iceberg that's visible, and a lot is under the water, and that the memoirist is not obligated to give the reader like their diary, or to cut open their brain, be like, here it is. But as a fiction writer, I had never been interested in protagonists who were, just always good and inspirational, or where all the hardships were, imposed externally out of bad luck or a villain. Like I was always interested in people who to some degree make a lot of their own trouble. And now it was me, now I was the one out there doing that. And so, I tried to look at myself and say, like, what would be interesting to you about this person if you were writing a novel? And like, would you be trying to protect her from X, Y, and Z, and I wouldn't have been. I mean, I was always interested in writing about people who made a lot of messy mistakes and who didn't always play by the rules and who weren't always, even in the ballpark of perfect. And so I tried to show that. And I also tried to be real about it, because I feel like sometimes when we show ourselves doing messed up things, and I think this exists even in fiction, there's also a lot of swagger or posturing around it, where it's just sort of like, well, particularly if you're into feminism, which I am and have been my entire life. And so I did not want to write a swaggering book where it was like, and then I broke off the chains of matrimony, and I had an affair, and hell yes, you should do it too. Like that. I wanted to really grapple with like, no, it's not the right solution for women to remain in situations where they feel unhappy or trapped or like they can't be their real selves. But it's also in no way the right solution to be like, I'll just lie to everyone and do what I want for years, and so kind of trying to grapple with the difference, I guess, between trying to actually have a new life, but also having to look at the choices I made along the way and damage that I did.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I guess to answer it really quickly is to say I had to not care if the reader liked me, which is a choice I've been making in fiction for a really, really long time.
And I feel like it's a kind of brave choice. I mean, in a strange way, what you were describing when you were saying that you're not interested in fiction that is about, in which, let's just say, the heroine, has all of her kind of woes thrust upon her, and isn't kind of culpable in any way. And in a way, I think of that as almost the demarcation line between a kind of pulp or mass market, fiction and, I don't know, literary fiction, in a way that we have to, in sort of like more evolved fiction, we want our protagonists to be morally complicated, and to make mistakes. And I'm going to read this one quote from the book that I sort of set aside, that is one of my favorite moments in the book. I guess you say, plenty of women resist patriarchal expectations without making spectacular messes of their personal lives. And wait, this is not, oh my God, you guys, I think that I have mismarked this. And this is actually something you said in an interview.
It's an interview quote. Yeah, it is.
Audience,
an interview quote.
I got the vaccine today and had like a mild allergic reaction and took like 50 Zyrtec. So I didn't have to use an EpiPen. And anyway, okay. This is something from an interview. Gina said, plenty of women resist patriarchal expectations without making spectacular messes of their personal lives. I wasn't one of them. And yet I insist that women can make massive mistakes and hurt people without being irredeemable or monstrous, a right we automatically grant to men. And there's a moment in the book where you say something like that, which I'm not going to try to find now. But anyway, it really spoke to me. And I feel like it is such an important thing to kind of bear in mind always as we read fiction and as we read anything and as we watch movies, that there's a way in which, it is true. There are these very different gender expectations that, like, sure, like I think about the sort of academic community that I live in, where like you go to the playground and there are all of these like 75-year-old men with their like 4-year-old kids because they're on their third or fourth wives who are students or whatever. And like, it's just like this part of life that, yeah, they're going to do that. But, for a woman to have an affair and leave her husband is still considered almost as shocking as it was, in the 19th century. So anyway, okay, I will stop talking now. And we have 6 questions. So I'm going to let everyone else ask questions. Okay. Why did you choose to write in the second person? Joseph asks.
So most of the book is not in the second person.
I almost added that.
So I write in a lot of different forms in the book. There's a great quote. I don't know who originally said it. It may have been Pam Houston. She's the one I heard it from, but she may have heard it from someone else. That says second person is a first person that's ashamed of itself, feeling guilty about itself. So I have experimented with second person in fiction plenty of times, and I love Book of Daniel by Doctorow, in which Daniel, his fictional narrator, writes about himself in third person sometimes, in first person. So I love experimentations with point of view. I'm obsessed with point of view. If anyone in the audience has ever taken a class with me, you know that. But so I decided to sort of lean into opening the book in a sort of externalized way, where I was like I first talk about myself as a character named A, for adulteress. And then I have a shift in that section where I say, in the math of accountability, A plus A plus A plus A plus A can never equal I. And then I shift to I. And I do second person in a chapter called Substitute Beauty, in which I recount my relationship as a kid with another girl in my neighborhood, who's actually a composite character of a few girls in my neighborhood, but sort of like the formation of my sexuality, and I refer to myself as you at various points in that chapter, and again shift to I, and that chapter is largely about like my imagination as a child and the way I hid behind imagination when my life was not somewhere I wanted to be, and how I started to kind of continue that pattern into adulthood. At first kind of like perfectly happily, but then to some extent even when I wanted to stop. And um you know that didn't happen anymore once I kind of stopped pretending to be somebody that I wasn't in my real life. I mean, so I think it was a form of evasion. It was a form of kind of like a mask, and yeah, I mean, I think I was just looking at all the different forms to approach. I mean, there's a section that is, in the form of a dictionary written to my then lover, now husband, like, and addresses him as you. So I do a lot of different point of view experimentation throughout the book. I guess because I love that. And also because I feel like you can convey meaning with that. Like you can show, the shifts of a person's consciousness based on kind of like how close or far they're letting themselves be to themselves. And, so as I said, most of the book is in first person, as memoirs traditionally are. But when I was looking at ways in which I was distancing myself from my own awareness, I would sometimes break into a different point of view just to sort of illustrate that.
Okay. Can you please tell us how you found the time in your very busy and complicated life to write this? You're while working, going through health issues, major health issues, raising children, teaching, going through a divorce, a very difficult divorce. How did you find the time to write this, and what does your writing practice look like? This is from Anne.
So my writing practice, first of all, like no one take notes. Like you don't want to, my writing practice is chaos. Like I don't have any sort of like wisdom to impart to anyone about my writing practice, except for that apparently you can write 5 books as well as 2 unpublished ones in a drawer without writing every day, because I've done it. I do lead a really, I lead a really busy life, but of course I am in academia. And so I don't have to go to an office from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day, like a lawyer or a doctor. I mean, so I am in my house more than certain people who have a lot of work. But while I'm in academia, I'm also always also serving as an editor somewhere. I'm doing my own writing. I have 3 kids, 2 of whom are now grown and out of the house. So, there is a lot going on all the time. And for that reason, sometimes I go 9 months without writing creative material of my own. Like I'm busy reading my students' material and reading, for LARB or whatever other magazine or something I'm doing at that time. But what I find happens if you are someone who's kind of hardwired to be a writer, I've been writing since I was 4. I was kind of just like born this way, which I think has nothing to do with whether or not you end up being any good at it. It's just I was born with a compulsion to write. And eventually it bubbles up and you can't not do it. Like you're pulling your car to the side of the road, writing on a napkin, you're having a conversation, and like the dialogue of the character you're trying to write is like in your head because you're trying not to forget it. You're in the shower and it's like you're writing scenes while you're shaving your legs. Like, so eventually a lot of stuff gets put on hold because it has to stop, and it has to like come out. And I write a lot in the summer. I don't tend to have conventional work hours in the summer because academia, and I'm really lucky that way. And I'm also really lucky that, I mean, my husband now is also a writer, so he gets it. And, and in my first marriage, my writing was supported as well. So I've been lucky that way. I think a lot of people, I had a long road to publication. My first book didn't come out until I was 37. So if you've been writing since you were 4, that's a long wait. I think a lot of people would have had people in their lives saying, like, you're not going anywhere, give it up. And I didn't have anyone in my life who said that. So I was really fortunate in that way.
My first book also came out when I was 37. And you interviewed me for that.
Yeah,
that's right. I just suddenly remembered that for the nervous breakdown. Okay, what are the hardest parts of writing a memoir? Was there any part of the book you found yourself writing over and over again, rewriting?
Oh yeah. I mean, writing memoirs hard. I mean, in no way do I want to make it sound like I think writing fiction or, short or long form fiction is somehow easy. But I think, writing memoir, it does have a particular terrifying bent to it, that makes it hard. And it's hard to look at yourself. Like, I mean, it's hard to look at things that you've done that were not the thing that you should have done, and it's hard to show that. I mean, there's a scene in the memoir where my daughters bust me in my affair by reading my texts, and it's very early in my affair. And I mean, that's the hardest scene I've ever written, because it was also the worst day of my life. And the biggest mistakes of my life were all wrapped up in that. I mean, I allowed the secret to go on for years after that. I ended the affair only briefly while claiming that I had permanently ended it. And, so, I mean, that is not a fun scene to write. That's not a fun thing to delve into. It's hard to write about your body, about having cancer and losing your breasts and, having chronic pain and being in a medical system where chronic pain is often interpreted to just be, trauma or neurosis in women. So there are a lot of hard things about it. It was hard exploring the difficulties that my now husband and I had when our affair first, became public and we transitioned to having an on the ground relationship. It didn't come overnight easily. It didn't all just like, woo, everything magically happily resolved. There was a period of about 20 months where things were very challenging. And, I didn't want to write about that, because this is like, I'm really happy now and I adore this person and we're married. And so, it'd be easy to just sort of fast forward to like, okay, and it all worked out. But I also wanted to show, that there is a big difference between having an affair, no matter how madly in love you are, and having a real life on the ground together. We lived 2,000 miles apart. I had children, he had no children. Like, there were all these things, and it felt important to show that in order to not have the swagger, I guess, like if I just fast forwarded it to like, now we're married and everything is fantastic, like it would have been false. I didn't want the book to be prescriptive in any way. I wanted it to raise questions and raise things for people to think about, not sort of be like, here is what to do. So in order to stick with that, I had to write a lot of hard things about myself and about my life.
I think the irony is that that's kind of what makes the book so magical, that nothing goes unexamined in a way. Like I love that aspect of it so much, that like when you, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use your husband's name, but am I allowed?
Yeah, you can. Rob.
Okay.
Fine. Yeah, everybody knows who he is.
When you and Rob, like, and he's visiting you in Chicago and staying at your sort of temporary apartment, and things are really hard. And there are so many moments like where things are hard and confusing, and it just kind of goes on and on and on. And I feel like for me, there is a kind of generosity of spirit in the way you chronicled those passages, like that you were sort of saying like, hey, this is not a romantic comedy, you know, this is not a fairy tale. Like, I'm not going to end this 100 pages earlier, right? Like, we're going to keep going past, you know, the ending of the, like the ending of the official story. And, you know, you were, when I say generosity of spirit, I just mean that there was a way in which you were saying like, I am not perfect, you know, we are not perfect, life is not perfect, and I'm going to sort of show all of this to you. And in a strange way, there's this kind of generosity toward the reader and this respect for the reader in that.
You know? I mean, I absolutely, you know, I believe really strongly that you have to respect the reader to come to their own conclusions. And I also feel like, I know that the books that I most love are very intimate books, and for better or for worse, I have a very hyper analytical mind. So I'm not actually sure whether I would have any idea how to write something where I wasn't like, and now let's look beneath the surface of this and let's look beneath the surface of that. Like it's one of my best friends, like my oldest friend in the world, my BFF Alicia, who may be in the audience today, has long told me that if she had to live in my head for 5 minutes, she would have an aneurysm. And so, you know, that's I guess that's brought to the book. And so actually in the editorial process, I had to cull some of it back because if anything, like I could really, you know, not attend to plot and moving things forward and kind of ruminate endlessly on something. And there was a lot to get to in this book. So I couldn't, you know, like dive deep into every single nook and cranny. But yeah, I mean, that it was important to me to respect the reader enough to show the complexities and to respect the reader enough to show my messy humanity and to allow them to take what they will take from the book.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I think so. We have officially 4 more questions, but I think there are 2 that maybe we'll try to get to if Sabir says it's okay. So maybe we'll try to do like a lightning round. So this is a great question, which is, will you talk about how rage from women is treated and greeted by readers? And this is something that was on my mind because of this review of the book that I felt like was really kind of the reviewer was really having trouble with. Oh, thank you, Sabir. That I felt like the reviewer was having trouble with the kind that there was rage in the book. I don't actually feel like this is a book fueled by rage, but she seemed to just feel very uncomfortable with anything that struck her. Like it's almost as if the rage struck her as unseemly. So anyway, so the question is, will you talk about how rage from women is treated and greeted by readers? And this is from
definitely. I mean, so first of all, I like you know, a lot of books that are full of rage. And I was talking about one last night. There's an amazing novel called Banshee by Rachel Dwoskin that is sort of like a really a really meticulous examining of a woman's repressed rage and how it comes out after she gets a scary medical diagnosis and she starts having an affair with one of her students. I do think that, like, if we look even, for example, at like the Brett Kavanaugh trial, like, I think that people interpret rage from men as either just incidental and not noteworthy at all because it's part of what is expected, or they view it as like righteous. I remember I was listening to NPR and Brett Kavanaugh had just had some tantrum, and the person on NPR was basically saying like, oh, well, and you know, of course, like his righteous anger, if you had been wrongly accused, you know, you would have this response. And I thought about how carefully Christine Ford, who of course had been, you know, raped, had to present herself with no rage, with no emotion, with that anything she did, she could be accused of being like a shrew or being hysterical. I think about of the book Citizen, where the career of Serena Williams and her treatment by the media and by other people in sports is deconstructed, and how particularly women of color are allowed even less, of a range with rage and other emotions than white women are. So I feel very strongly about the fact that women are equally entitled to rage as men, and in fact that there are many things that women have a lot of reasons to be in rage. But I also feel like that to be only enraged is a limited range of emotions, just like to be cool is a limited range of emotions. And I'm not interested in there only being one present emotion. So to me, I think what is interesting is like intersecting rage with guilt, intersecting, love with fear, intersecting like all these different things, at once, because we hold a lot of emotions simultaneously about almost everything in our lives. And so, in no way was I kind of setting out to write a manifesto of rage, so to speak. But I do think that that rage definitely makes people uncomfortable in women, and in people of color, and that is a societal problem. We see that in the difference between how a BLM protest is treated versus, a bunch of white guys breaking into the Capitol, and so, I mean, I think it's a really complex question. And I think, that it's a question that is part of a larger cultural conversation that definitely includes more than just women.
Yeah, and there's something I just want to say, which is that I feel like in the reviews and just discussions of the book that I read there, because it just came out, there's not a giant bulk of material, but I have been seeing a lot about kind of like rage, and people sort of talking about, the word woes came up in several reviews. It was interesting to me, because I'm not just saying this for those of you who haven't read the book yet, because I actually, reading this book in sort of a vacuum for the first time, I found it to be actually a book that's as I've said, there's this tremendous urgency to the narration that I absolutely love. That's exactly what I want from any book, like this incredible urgency. But I found it to be a book that is also filled with joy and wonder, and and ultimately, it's kind of a book about happiness and love. And, I love, I mean, it's a book, a memoir in which there's so much exploration. And so what that means is that there's so many moments. Hearing it described as sort of like with words like rage and woes make it sound like it's this kind of memoir where all of these horrible things happen and you're angry and vindictive, but the book does not read to me did not read that way at all. I found it to be like a book that was written from a position of kind of generosity, power, love, and kind of excitement about life. Like the narrator, like there's this incredible enthusiasm and just joy at being alive. So yeah, anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
I'll tell you one funny thing. So a person on Goodreads began a review with this woman had a really crappy life, and it's like, and that is, of course, that's the thing of memoir, obviously, like, or of fiction, like you're writing about the troubles, right? You're not writing about like, the day you had a good day and went home and nothing happened, I mean, so you're writing obviously always about sort of sticky situations and trouble, but the idea that like this woman had a really crappy life, like it could not be further from the truth. Like, first of all,
No.
I had literally like the most loving parents, particularly my mother. My father loved me enormously, but like I had an extraordinary mother, and I was gifted with so much unconditional love and support from my mother that being an adult in the world now, I can see how rare it is for someone to have been so loved and so supported by their parents, and to feel so safe emotionally with their parents, as I did, that I think from the get-go, I was one of the luckiest people alive, and I have amazing friends, I have three super amazing children who I just absolutely adore. I have, been able to make a life out of doing things that I love, like writing and teaching. And, so my husband was going to make a mug that said this woman has had a really crappy life, and give it to me as a gift, because we think we think it's funny. And I don't mean to say I don't mean to make fun of that review. Obviously, like once you're on the page, people bring their own meaning, and you don't get to sit there anymore and say that's not the meaning. Like, it's on the page, and the reader brings their own context, and they make of it what they will. But that's not how I've experienced my life. Like, I think pointing out issues of classism, issues of sexism, issues of institutionalized misogyny, like, is not the same as having a really crappy life, unless we want to say every woman on the planet has had a really crappy life, which, God knows, I hope that's not true. And that's not how I have experienced being in my own skin.
I think we have one last question that I think maybe we'll try to answer. Writing from personal experience can be therapeutic. Did you learn something about yourself while writing this book?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't, in some ways, I reject the idea of writing as being like therapeutic or cathartic, because I think, yes, writing is therapeutic and cathartic, but by the time you get it into the form in which it's going to be a published book and go out into the world, that stage is past, so it's like parts of this book like were originally things that I was writing in private and secret, like for catharsis, right? Because I was going through a lot of things, but to then translate them into something you hope will be artful, something you hope will be multidimensional, that will not just be in like the vacuum of a moment of crisis and how you looked at it in that specific minute. You have to move beyond the idea that the point of this book is somehow for me to purify myself with catharsis or something, or to emerge, like I saved myself 8 years of therapy, I wrote this book instead. Like, so I don't think of it that way, but I did learn a lot about myself writing the book. But I've learned a lot about myself writing every book, even books that weren't about me. But definitely there's no question that I came out of the book differently, and that and in most ways, in most ways that actually had to do with realizing that kind of like my own singular lens of how something was affecting me was not actually the only lens, and that I needed to widen the lens and consider what other people were also going through, and I think that art should do that.
Yes, that's a great note to end on.
Thank you both so much for such a fascinating and interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope our audience did too. But judging by the comments, I think that's less of a hope and more of a assured. Yes.
Thank you all for being here. I didn't see the comments, but that's great.
But I guess to end with, if you haven't already bought a copy of Blow Your House Down, if you're watching via Facebook, you can click on the link in the description. If you're watching on Crowdcast, you can click on the green button which says purchase. And if you would like to purchase any of Joanna Rakoff's titles, we have both her novel and her memoir on strandbooks.com, and you can just search her name and pull it right there. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for such a pleasure.
Thank you, Joanna. And thank you everyone for coming.
Great night.